Howdy, folks, and welcome to another day in the Milky Way. And tonight we're going to be reading from that book again, Life Among the Indians, with our series of Indian myths and legends. Of course, I'm not live, but you all know that already. But anyway, this is the Life Among the Indians, or personal reminiscences and historical incidences. And this was by Reverend James B. Finley. Now, this book was wrote sometime in the 1800s, as I've mentioned before. It's very old. The pages are falling apart. And we had left off, I forget what page we left off at, but either way, here's the bookmark and it's in there. And so now we're going to read from this. So I'll start at this spot. So enjoy what you can, and you'll have to go back and watch part one. And I know this is a fairly long book, sort of. You can see it's kind of thick, but it's a small book. Anyway, so there's a lot to it. So anyway, I'm gonna start here, and you can join along. I think there's a PDF out there somewhere, and I think I have it, but I'm pretty sure I do have it actually. Thanks to Lucky Stone. Okay, here we go. I'm going to read as long as I can until my eyes get tired, and we're going to call it quits. This brings down the narrative of events leading to the connection of our family with the history of this region till my father's first attempt to explore it, with the view to its settlement. This was in 1795, when the day appointed for the rendezvous at Massey Station arrived. There were assembled, including those from my father's two congregations, and from Pennsylvania, about 60 individuals, all burning with ardent desire to see with their own eyes the country of whose fertility they had heard so much, and which seemed to them the land of promise. The party felt more secure from the attacks of the Indians because General Wayne was at the time in treaty with them in Greenville, and therefore they pushed boldly forward into the interior. They were divided into three companies, one led by Massey, one by Finley, and the third by Falchek, an old pioneer among the Indians. In a few days, they reached Paint Creek near the falls. They encamped for the night, and in the morning, they found they were in the vicinity of a body of Indians. Proceeding down the creek, soon came within hearing of their horse bells. It was now too late to draw back, and an action with the Indians was inevitable. Some of the company were what was called raw hands, that is, unaccustomed to border life and the adventure. Full of enthusiasm, they had often expressed a desire to smell Indian powder. One of the party who had fought during the Revolutionary War and also with the Indians retorted upon the vaulting fellows, "If you get the smell, you will run, or I'm very much mistaken." Their vaunted courage was now brought to the test. Leaving Captain Pete with a rear guard, the three divisions under Massey, Finley, and Falchek made a simultaneously attack upon the Indian camp. They proved to be a party of the Shawnees and the Senecas, who had refused to enter into treaty. Charlie Wilkie was their leader, and they were encamped on the bank of the creek at what was called Reeves Crossing. They were taken completely by surprise. 2 of them were killed and several wounded, and the rest took flight. But after escaping across the creek, they rallied in the woods for a short time and returned the salute of the whites. One man, Joshua Robinson from Pennsylvania, was shot dead. As the old Revolutionary veteran had predicted, some of the raw hands who had boasted so much fled at first, smell of Indian powder, and hid behind the logs in the rear. Captain Pate reported them while in this condition as having the shakes from the trembling of their bodies. The company, having buried their dead companions, hastily gathered the horses and skins, equipment, and other plunder of the Indian camp and started for the station at 3 Islands. That night, they reached the Skiato Brush Creek, and they were encamped upon the invaded spot. So I'm tongue tied. Suspecting the Indians would be on the pursuit, their sentinels were carefully posted for the night. Just before daybreak, one of the sentinels perceived something gradually working toward him on the ground. Calling out, he received no answer, and instantly leveling his piece, probably wounding or killing the Indian. The battle now commenced. The Indians met with a noble resistance from a part of the men, while the others again displayed their cowardice by hiding from the bullets of the enemy in the deep sinkhole in the earth. The action lasted about an hour, when the Indians retreated with the loss of 2 killed and several wounded on the part of the whites. Several horses were killed, and one man, Mr. Gillifan, was wounded in the thigh. After this, the party made good their return to the station without further molestation. This ended the exploration of the Sitio Valley for that year, and it was also the last battle fought with the Indians during the Old Indian War. The peace concluded by General Wayne and the Indians during the year remained inviolate and gave protection to the settler, except in rare cases, till 1812. And then the swelling tide of civilization had swept the poor Indian away from the rich valleys where had been the homes of his fathers for untold generations. The narrow escape for the exploring party in the Sitio Valley did not extinguish the desire to become possessed of those fertile lands. Accordingly, in the spring of 1796, another party was organized for a second attempt. They collected at Massey Station about the 1st of March. Then some of them proceeded by land and their horses. The others went by water, carrying in their boats provisions, farming utensils, that word just rubbed out, so sorry, and other things, farming tools, and other things necessary to make permanent settlement. The party numbered about 40, and on their arrival, they immediately commenced turning up the rich soil of the prairie with their plows, and soon had 300 acres planted. There were some suffering from scarcity of provisions during the first few months, but an abundant crop of corn, together with the game which abounded in the forest, soon yielded a large supply. In August of that year, Colonel Massey selected the site for the town and laid out the lots, each of the original settlers receiving 1 graftus. I don't know what a graftus is, but they got one. To this town, he gave the name Chillicothe. Chillicothe. This was an Indian name, but of what significance or to what applied by them is not well ascertained. The Sitio, for the most part, runs in a very regular channel, almost due south, but about 4 or 5 miles above the mouth of the Paint Creek, the river suddenly makes a bend and runs a short distance east, hence southeast to where it receives the waters of the tributary. These 2 rivers, for several miles above the junction run nearly parallel to each other. Between them is a large and beautiful bottom, varying in breadth from 2 miles and containing upwards of 3,000 acres. This land is of vaulted formation and the loam being from 2 to 10 feet in depth. Nothing can exceed its fertility, not even the most highly cultivated soils. It is the western boundary. It is a hill 200 or 300 feet in height. The terminus of the bottomlands in that direction. The spot selected for the town site was on an elevated and dry part of the bottom, near the base of this hill. More than 20 log cabins were immediately erected, and before ensuing winter, it had several stores and shops. The tide of population now began to set in with unexampled rapidity. Zane Trace, which connected Wheeling and Maysville, was marked out simply by blazing trees along the route. Though just completed, it became a great thoroughfare, and large companies passed along it seeking the rich bottomlands of the Ohio. These bottoms were first settled and were generally covered by heavy growth of timber, such as black walnut, sugar tree, cherry, buckeye, hackberry, and other trees which denote a rich soil. A portion of them, however, were found desolate of timber and formed beautiful prairies clothed with bluegrass and blue sledge grass, which grew in the height of 4 to 8 feet and furnished a bountiful supply of pasture in summer and hay in the winter for the livestock of the settlers. The outer edges of these properties were beautifully fringed, or prairies, or these edges of these prairies were beautifully fringed around with the plum tree and the red and black haw, the mulberry and crabapple. In the month of May, when these nurseries of nature's God were in full bloom, the site was completely gratified with the fragrant and delicious perfume which filled the surrounding atmosphere. Was significant to fill and lull the soul with essence of pleasure. Some of these lands have borne 60 successive crops of corn, while the only dressing ever bestowed upon them is that provided by nature in the rich sediment deposited upon them in their annual overflow. In the fall of this year, I returned to Kentucky and took charge of a colored family formerly belonging to my father, but who had been freed by him to conduct them to the new settlement. After a tedious journey of 16 days across the country, I reached the banks of the Cito 1 mile below town. Here we built log cabins and spent the winter. I fed them on pounded meal, hominy, and wild game. By spring, their sleek, glossy looks attested to the excellency of their keeping. Then my father's family moved out, and we commenced again in this new world. The Indian Wars, which had harassed the new settlements, first in Pennsylvania and then Virginia, and then in Kentucky and Ohio for a period of 40 years, now had been brought to an end. So thoroughly humbled were the Indian tribes that little was now to be apprehended from them. Indeed, they now mingled among the whites in the most friendly manner, and for years continued entirely peaceful, except for inflamed by ardent spirits, that bane of the poor Indian, or exceeded to the revenge by some wrong inflicted upon them. In a case of this kind occurred during the summer of 1798. A Wyandot Indian came one evening into town somewhat intoxicated and behaved with great rudeness. He was reprimanded by Mr. Thomas. Thomas, who was a very athletic man, the Indian drew his knife and concealed the blade of it in his arm sleeve, waiting his opportunity to attack Thompson. A person who observed him advised him to leave for the camp, for if Thompson should find out that he had drawn his knife, he would kill him. The Indian mounted his horse but refused to leave the place. Someone informed Thompson of his danger, and he immediately seized a handspike and, striking the Indian on the head, felled him to the earth. That night, the Indian died of his wounds and was carried to the Indian encampment. As soon as the Indians learned the cause of his death, they immediately demanded Thompson that they might punish him according to their law, which was life for life, and informed the town that if he was not given up, they would fall upon the place and murder and revenge men, women, and children, which they could easily have done, as they were much more numerous than whites. Some of the inhabitants were for complying, but the majority were opposed to it. After some considerable consultation, it was agreed to try another method, which was to buy the life of the murderer by making presents to the relations of the murdered man and promising to punish the murderer according to our law. This plan succeeded, and Thompson was placed under guard for four men, there being no jail there at the time. After some 2 months, he was permitted to make his escape, and one of the guards went with him. The half-brother of the deceased, determining to avenge the death of his brother, took with him another Indian, and waylaying Zane's trace, they found two young men traveling alone, whom they killed and robbed of their horses and effects, and thus two innocent men paid the debt of a murderer who, under the influence of whiskey, committed the crime. Such were some of the evils and dangers brought on the community by strong drink. The community were at length aroused to take efficient measures for the suppression of the evils brought upon them by the whiskey traders. The Indians flocked in from all parts of to trade their furs and procure whiskey. It was the custom of the traders to give and sell whiskey to the Indians, and the conquest was that many of them became intoxicated, and as a drunken Indian is a dangerous creature, the peace of society was disturbed, and the women and children were in constant state of alarm day and night. After mature deliberation and free discussion, it was enacted that all traders who sold spirits to the Indians or in any way furnished them with intoxicating liquors should be required to keep all Indians made drunk by them in their own storehouses till they were sober on plenty for the first offense of being reprimanded by two persons appointed for the purpose. And on the second offense, their kegs or barrels of whiskey or strong drink were to be taken into the street and tomahawked till all their contents were poured out. This law was set at naught by one of the traders, Mr. M., but it was promptly executed to the letter the next day after the sentence. This vigorous maintenance of the law on the part of the citizens made the traders more cautious and gave more safety and comfort to the inhabitants. The holding of courts and administration of the justice in the new settlement was generally after a very primitive model. A single instance may serve for illustration. In 1797, 3 justices were appointed by the governor of the territory for the settlement of Chillicothe. One of them, Samuel Smith, appears to have done most of the business. His prompt and decisive manner of doing business rendered him very popular. His docket could be understood only by himself, Scarcely was a warrant issued by him, as he preferred always to send his constable to the accused to bring him forward to have prompt justice executed. No logbook was of any authority with him. He always justified his own proceedings by saying that all laws were intended for the purpose of enforcing justice, and that he himself knew what was right, and that therefore he stood in need of no laws to be govern his actions. In civil and criminal cases, he was always prompt in his decisions and sometimes amusing in his mode of executing justice, as will be seen from the following case, which was brought under his cognizance. A man by the name of Adam M. Murdy cultivated some ground in the station prairie below Chillicothe. One night, someone stole during his absence his horse collar. M. Murdy next morning examined the collars of the plowman then at work and discovered his collar in the possession of one of the men and claimed it of him. The man used toward him abusive language and threatened to whip M. Murdy for charging him with the theft. M. Murdy went immediately to the Squire Smith and stated his case. The squire listened till his story was told and then dispatched his constable with strict orders to bring the thief and collar forthwith. Therefore, the constable quickly returned, bringing with him in one hand the collar, while with the other his grasp tightened around the accused. The squire immediately arraigned an accused in his court, which was held in the open air on the bank of the Sitio. It was then asked of the accuser how he could prove the collar was his. And Murdy replied, "If the collar is mine, Mr. Spear, who is present, can testify." Mr. Spear was then called to testify. Before he was sworn, he came forward and said that if it was Mr. M. Murdy's collar, he himself had page of the collar. The squire turned up the ear of the collar and found accordingly M. Murdy's name written there. No better proof could be given, said the squire, and ordered the accused to be immediately tied up to a buckeye to receive 5 lashes, well laid on, which was accordingly done. Thus ended the case to the satisfaction of all, except the culprit. The trial did not occupy 5 minutes of time. Such was the squire's summary manner of dispensing justice. Squire Smith was an honest and impartial man with a vigorous and discriminating mind, always disposing to do justice in his own way. We now have narrated the circumstances under which the pioneer entered the Northwest Territory, across the Ohio River, and obtained a firm foothold in what had been therefore empathically an Indian country. The tide of population now began to roll in. Unexampled force and settlements were made all along the Ohio and up the rich valleys of its many noble tributaries. Civilization had driven down its stakes in the very house or home of the Indians, and a new era was opening up in this region. It will be interesting for the reader to pause at this point and glance backward at some of the incidents of Indian life and warfare in this region, but we must reserve this for another chapter. Yep, looks like it was pretty violent life back then. Yeah, and justice was quick, believe it or not. You wouldn't want to be caught doing something wrong, so you'd have to mind your P's and Q's. I wonder what happened all of that nowadays. People might not do so many things wrong, but the majority of us are very honest. It's just that group of a few that end up ruining it for everybody. You know what I mean? Anyway, chapter 2. Believe it or not, all that reading is for 2 chapters. I'll read as much as I can. This one's called Incidents of Indian Life and Warfare. During the long series of Indian wars to which I have referred, Old Chakotay and the surrounding region witnessed many thrilling adventures, as well as fearful tragedies. It was the headquarters of the Shawnees and the principal places of rendezvous from which the war parties went forth on their excursions against the white settlers among the cane brakes of Kentucky and along the Ohio border. As early as 1761, when the Indians made a descent upon the settlement of the James River, Mr. or Mrs. Dennis, who was then captured, was brought over the mountains and through the forest to this place. Her husband was murdered soon after he was taken, and she, seeing no way to escape, confronted or conformed to the usages of the Indians, painted and dressed herself, and lived like a squaw. And in addition to this, she gained great fame by attending to the sick, both as a nurse and a physician. She soon became so celebrated for the cures she effected as to obtain the reputation of being a necromancer, and the natives paid to her the honor due to a person supposed to have power with the Great Spirit. After continuing among them 2 years, she went out one day under the pretense of obtaining medical herbs, as she had often done before. Not returning at the usual time, her object was suspected, and the Indians started in pursuit of her. To avoid leaving traces of her path, she crossed the Saco 3 times and was making her 4th crossing 40 miles below the town, where she was discovered and fired upon without effect. But in the speed of her flight, she wounded her foot with a sharp stone, so as to be unable to proceed. The Indians had crossed the river and were just behind her. She eluded their pursuit by hiding in a hollow sycamore log. They frequently stepped on the log that concealed her and encamped near it for the night. Next morning, they proceeded in their pursuit of her, and she started in another direction as fast as her lameness would permit, but was obliged to remain near the place 3 days. She then set off for the Ohio, over which she rafted herself on a drifting log at the mouth of the Great Kanawha. She traveled only by night, concealing herself by day and sustaining on roots, wild fruits, and river shellfish. At length, she reached the Great Barrier, having passed forests, rivers, and mountains more than 300 miles. Here she laid down exhausted and resigned herself to die when provincially she was discovered by some of the people of the settlement, who kindly took her, supplied her with wants, and sent her forward. For this act of mercy, the whole settlement suffered a dreadful penalty at the hands of the savages. 60 warriors came to it, pretending the most perfect friendship, for it was a time of peace. While the inhabitants were treating their guests with hospitality and altogether without the least suspicion, the Indians rose up upon them, killed nearly every man in the settlement, and carried the women and children away to captivity. Chakotay was also the scene of Daniel Boone's captivity in 1776. In January of that year, he went to Lower Blue Licks, which with about 30 men to make salt for the different settlements. On the 7th of the next month, while he was in the woods on a hunt to supply the salt makers with food, he came upon a party of 102 Indians marching to the salt of Boonesboro, the third attempt upon that ill-fated place. Boone fled, but the savages pursued and took him prisoner. They then advanced upon the licks and made 27 of the salt miners prisoner and by captivation, or oh boy, prisoners by captivation. Delighted with their signal success, the Indians marched their prisoners off in triumph through the forest and across Ohio to Chakotay. After spending about a month here, 11 of the prisoners, among whom was Boone, was carried to Detroit and presented to the British commandant and at the commandant at the post. He offered them 100 pounds as a ransom for Boone, and they refused it. And while his company was left, he was compelled to return with the Indians to Chakotay. The British offered him some necessary supplies for his wants, but his noble spirit refused to accept them from enemies of his country when he had to no prospect of ever being able to pay for them. This was about the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Soon after his return to Chakotay, he was adopted into a family of one of the principal men of the tribe. He wisely appeared to be reconciled to his new way of life and accommodated himself to it with cheerfulness. Such deployment by such a mighty hunter and untamed spirit could not but win the confidence and affection of his masters. When challenged to a trial of his skill with the rifle, he found it much less difficult to surpass them in the closeness of his shooting than to vanquish the envy and ill will created by the visible superiority in a point of so much importance in the eyes of that race. But he found it easy to integrate himself with the chief of the Shawnees by showing great difference to him and by always granting him a share of the proceeds of his hunts. His skills and success in hunting secured for him great honor among the Indians. This manner of life and wild adventure was so in accordance with his instinctive prosperities and acquired habits that it is highly probable his seeming acquaintance in his lot would in the end have become real, had it not been for the remembrance of his wife and children at Boonesboro. These cherished recollections constantly haunted his mind and prompted the desires and the purpose to escape. In June, he was taken to the Cito salt workers and there compelled to labor so hard in making salt that no chance of escape occurred. On his return with his masters to Chakotay, he found 450 warriors assembled and accounted in all their horrible painting and war garnish, prepared for an expedition against Boonesboro. With all his love of country and family natural to such a man, he now became thoroughly bent upon an attempt to escape at any and every hazard. In the morning, he arose and went forth as usual to engage in the hunt. This was done in a manner not to excite the suspicion of the savages. He had secreted a little food, but only enough for a single meal. In less than 5 days, he traversed a distance of 160 miles, fording or rafting across the rivers in his course. He found the fort in no state of preparation for the formidable attack, and that was impending. But his timely warning enabled them to put themselves in so complete of a state of defense that the savages were defeated, and that the loss of 37 of their warriors was compelled to retreat. During this same year, to illustrate the restlessness activity of the pioneers, Boone, taking advantage of the knowledge acquired during his captivity, set out with a company of select men to surprise the Pink Creek town in Indian settlement not far from the place where Massey, Finley, and Falchuk had their conflict with the Indians on their first expedition into the Sito country. Having arrived with 4 miles of the place, they met an armed party of 30 Indians. An exemplar battle was fought, resulting in the flight of the savages. Not one of Boone's party fell, but knowing that it would be perilous to continue longer in that region, they marched back to Boonesboro, which with all possible dispatch. It is painful to think of the uncertainty of life in which both the white citizen and the Indian lived at this period. In the moment of great apparent security, the sudden crack of the rifle might be the harbinger of their doom. The state of life soon became far from being unpleasant to the backwoodsman of real metal. In fact, its excitements often became a sort of necessity with him and essentials to his happiness. Another effect of this was seen in the acuteness of their perceptions and the lighting like rapidly with which they made their observations and reached their conclusions. Especially was this the case with the Indians. A noise inappreciable to our ordinary ear, a broken twig or a leaf or a faintest impression on the grass, the hooting of an owl or a gobbling of a turkey was sufficient to attract their attention. From these faint indications, they were quick to discern the presence of a wild beast or of an enemy. An anecdote told by Frost in his book of the Indians is to the point. An Indian, upon his return home to his hut one day, discovered that his venison, which had been hung up to dry, had been stolen. After going some distance in pursuit of the thief, he met a party of travelers of whom he inquired whether they had seen a little old white man with a short gun and accompanied by a small dog with a bob tail. They replied in the affirmative and asked the Indian how he was able to give such a minute description of the thief. He answered, "I know he is a little man by his having made a pile of stones in order to reach the venison from the height I hung it standing on the ground. I know he is an old man by his short steps, which I have traced over the dead leaves in the woods. I know he is a white man by the turning of his toes when he walks, which is an Indian never does. I know his gun is short by the mark which the muzzle made upon the bark of a tree against which it leaned. I know the dog is small by his tracks, and that he has a bob tail. I discovered by the mark in the dust where he was sitting at the time his master took down the meat." I will add still another instance of quick perceptions and an acute observation of the red man. The most ignominious and shocking murder was once committed by a party of Indians on 14 white settlers within 5 miles of Shamokin in Pennsylvania. The surviving whites, in their rage, determined to take their revenge by murdering a Delaware Indian who happened to be in the vicinity and anticipated no danger from the whites. He had ever been their friend and was generally known among them by the name of Duke Holland. The poor Indian declared that his tribe had encapsulated of committing was incapable of committing such a fraud crime in a time of profound peace, and told turn the page told enraged sellers that the act must have been perpetrated by some vile Mingos or Iroquois. But all his protesting were in vain, and he could not convince the experted men whose minds were fully bent on revenge. At last he offered to go with the party in quest of the murders, and he said he was sure he could discover in their traces evidence that they belonged to the Six Nations and not to the Delawares. The proposal was accepted, and the party followed the Indian traces and soon found themselves in the most rocky part of the mountains, where not one of the whites could discover a single track, nor would they believe that men had ever passed over the track, as they had to jump from rock to rock or crawl along the edges of the precipices and through almost impassable chasms. They soon began to suspect that the Indian had led them across these rugged mountains in order to give the murderers time to escape or to betray them into their hands. They threatened him with instant death the moment they should be convinced of this fraud. The Indian, to allay their fears as they ran along, showed them here where the moss had been trodden down by the weight of the human foot, and there that it had been torn and dragged forward from its place. Again, he would point out to them that pebbles or small stones on the rocks had been removed from their beds by the foot hitting against them, that dry sticks that by being trodden upon were broken, and it was particular place that the Indian's blanket had been dragged over the rocks and had removed or loosened the leaves lying there, so that they did not lie flat on as in other places. All these marks could perceive as long as he walked along without stopping, while with the closest observation, unaccustomed eye of the white man would fail to discover any significant trace. At last he discovered more distinct indentations of the feet of some soft ground. From these he learned that the enemy was 8 in number, and he also observed from the freshness of the footprints that they could not be very far in advance. All these predictions were soon verified, for gaining on the summit of an eminence, they discovered the Indians encamped on the other side of the valley. Some of them had already lain down to sleep, while others were drying off their leggings for the same purpose. The scalps of the murdered men were also hanging up to dry. See, said Du Collin, there is the enemy, not of my nation, but the Mingos. They are in our power. In less than half an hour, in less than half an hour, they will be all fast asleep. We need not fire a gun, but go right up and tomahawk them. We are 2 to 1 nearly. Come on, you will now have your revenge. Straight to tell, the whites who had been so readily to take revenge by murdering an innocent and defenseless Indian now showed the white feather. They declined making the attack and besought the Indians to take them back by the nearest and best way. This he did, and when they reached home, and they reported that the number of Indians was so great that they did not venture to attack them. Attacking an Indian camp and killing a poor Indian already in their power were things very different. But we must return to the life scenes of the Cito region. One of the most considerable conflicts had with the Indians in Chakotay occurred in 1779. The tide of population was then setting strongly into their adjacent hunting grounds in the west, and through that they had not had not intelligence and steadiness of purpose enough to effect the organized and persistent combination to roll back the tide. They did what they could, singly and in detail, to check the progress. All the savage cruelty in their nature was intensified by their thirst for revenge, but their mode of warfare was mainly by detached aggression, falling upon the individuals and stragglers by stealth, waylaying travelers, surprising families, thus butchering individuals and destroying their dwellings. The terrible events were of no unfrequent occurrence, and it was really astonishing that they had so little effect in retarding the growth of the population. The people now begun to feel necessity of some combined and more efficient action to check these savages. The barbarities, the barbarities, according to the conviction of the settlers, was held at Hasburg and was determined to carry the war into the enemy's countries. As the Shawnee had been most conspicuous in their hostilities, it was determined to fit out an armed expedition against the old Chakotay, who was their chief town. 200 volunteers were enrolled, comprising many of the most respectable citizens. The command was given to Colonel Bowman, and under him, Logan, Holland, Herod, and Burglar commanded. They reached Coatley undiscovered in July towards sunset. After deliberating, it was resolved to the attack till dawn and succeeding morning. The force was divided into two detachments, and one commanded by Colonel Bowman and the other by Captain Logan. One division took its position on the right and the other on the left, and upon the given signal, they were to surround the town and attack it in concert. The party commanded by Logan repaired to the assigned point and waited in vain for the signal. The attention of the Indians was drawn to this point by the barking of a dog. At the same moment, a gun was accidentally discharged by one of the other party, and the whole village, of course, was aroused in a moment. The women and children were hurried into the woods through a path not yet occupied by the assailants, and the warriors collected in a strong cabin. All this passed under the eyes of Logan's party, who immediately took possession of some of the deserted cabins. It was now broad daylight, and the frequent shots were exchanged between the parties. The expedient of Logan to march safely to the assault of the cabin was an ingenious one, and as far as our reading extends original, he proposed to the party to tear off the Indians' cabin's doors, each to carry one before him as a breastwork, and advancing upon the Indian cabin where the warriors were assembled. As they were marching upon the foe behind their movable wall, Colonel Bowman perceived that their plan was surprising the Indians, was disconcerted, set an order to retreat. Captain Logan's party was astonished at this order and reluctant to obey it. The retreat must take place over an open prairie, exposed to the covert fire of the Indians. Instead of the concerted retreat in good order, everyone endeavored to make the best of his way from the danger in the mode indicated by his own judgment. Each one started away from behind his concealment and made for the woods at his utmost speed. Some of their number fell by the bullets which the savages showered upon them as they fled over the prairie. The stragglers assembled in the woods and assumed something like order. The Indians sailed out upon their invaders, commanded by the chief, Blackfish. They were much inferior in numbers and not exceeding 30. Yet Colonel Bowman's force, once intimidated, continued to fly before them under the impulse of terror and were sorely pressed. His force was brought to a halt in a low and sheltered ground. His fire upon the surrounding enemy, who were protected behind bushes, proceeding little effect. Captain Logan and Herod mounted some pack horses and made a charge upon the Indians. This assault somewhat staggered them. Blackfish was killed, and the Indians in their turn took to flight. The men pursued and an unmolested march homeward. In this ill-managed expedition, 9 men were killed and 1 wounded. The Indian loss was comparatively small, though the number of the killed among them were never fully ascertained. But we must hasten over 3 events, though now removed from us by the space of 3/4 of a century. They were fresh when with others. The writer assisted to carry the tide of civilization into the region. In 1780, the Kentucky Rangers under Colonel Clark destroyed not only the cornfields of the Indians at Chakotay, but also everything that related to subsistence on which they could lay their hands. Thus, for a time, the savages were compelled to relinquish their barbarous and treacherous assaults upon the settlers and devote themselves to the hunt in order to obtain subsistence for their people. But it was the grand rendezvous of the Shawnee, Wyandots, Fawns, and Potawatomis, and various other tribes, predatory to their incursion into Kentucky in the summer of 1782, of which a more particular account will be given when we come to narrate in the history of that monster, Simon Girty, who was one of the leading spirits in the savage council. Thus, the very fall, the whites took revengeance on the destruction of all the cabins of Chakotay through the Indians themselves and escaped. In 1791, Old Chakotay was the scene of a desperate battle between General Hammer and the Indians. He had entered the Indian country from Fort Washington, now Cincinnati, at the head of 1,453 men. Colonel Hardin, with 600 Kentucky militia, formed a reckoning party in advance. The Indians everywhere fled in as he approached, setting fire to their villages and destroying their goods with their own hands. To overtake them, he placed himself at the head of a scout of 210 men and pushed ahead with great rapidity. The scout was attacked by an inconsiderable party of Indians when the raw militia broke and fled, leaving the brave men who would not fly to their fate. 23 of the party fell, and only a small portion succeeded in rejoining the army. Yet General Hammer pushed on and succeeded in reducing most of the Indian towns to ashes and destroying their provisions. When within 8 miles of Chakotay on the Little Miami, he halted and late at night sent forward Colonel Hardin to attack the enemy. The action commenced early in the morning, and the savages fought with desperation. Some of the American troops again acted the coward, but the officers bore themselves gallantly and utterly regardless of personal safety, rushed forward into the thickness of the fight. It was a severe and disastrous conflict. More than 50 regulars and 100 militia and a hard portion of the officers, including brave Fontaine, Willis, and Frothingham, were slain upon the battleground. The number of the enemy slain was not known, but it must have been great, as General Hammer permitted to retire without molestation. Hammer, in his official report, claimed the victory, but it was doubtful which party lost more by the conflict. And I think I'm going to stop right there because my eyes are getting tired. Okay, well, I hope you all enjoyed that. That was just a little cut of it, and we will pick that up just as soon as I possibly can. Well, thanks for joining me tonight, and I hope I can read some more sooner. I got to get back on track and push forward, as they always say. I'm doing what I can, and we're going to find all out about the Indians. It sounds like from this book that it was quite the treacherous thing. Tax on one and tax on the other. Oh man, I don't know if it'd be great to live in those days, or one day you could just wake up and life would be non-existent for you. Your house would be burnt down. I don't think they had insurance. So, all right, everybody. Remember, be the frequency you want to receive. Peace. I love y'all.